On any map, Ohio looks ordinary. A stretch of suburbs, highways, and old industrial towns. But buried in that normalcy are 20 stories that prove this state is anything but safe. Children vanished walking home from school. Entire neighborhoods were terrorized by killers hiding in plain sight. And some mysteries have lingered for decades, with answers that never came. Each case we uncover takes you one step deeper, until by the end, you'll realize the most terrifying thing about Ohio is how familiar it feels. So, lock the door, dim the lights, and picture yourself in the quiet of an Ohio night. The streets feel familiar, the houses look safe, but history says otherwise. If stories like these are the kind you can't stop thinking about, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and consider subscribing to hear more of them. Now, let's start in the 1930s, when Cleveland discovered bodies scattered in Kingsbury Run. In the 1930s, Cleveland police began finding mutilated bodies near the train yards of Kingsbury Run. The first bodies were discovered lying in tall weeds beside rusted tracks. They had been dismembered with a level of precision that investigators had never seen before. Each cut appeared almost surgical. Some victims' heads were missing. Others were drained of blood. Police quickly realized they might be dealing with a serial killer. Locals soon gave him a name that would define his legacy: the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run stretched across the east side of Cleveland, a low area filled with rail lines, shanty towns, and the city's poorest residents. The Great Depression had left thousands jobless. People built temporary shelters from scrap wood and tin, living close to train fires for warmth. In that environment, it wasn't unusual for someone to disappear. Many assumed the missing had simply left to find work elsewhere. When the first torsos appeared, few recognized how serious it was. The butcher seemed to know that here his victims would not be missed right away. City leaders turned to Eliot Ness, the celebrated lawman who had brought down Chicago's bootleggers. Ness now served as Cleveland's safety director and promised to end the killings. He ordered massive raids through the shanty towns, burning camps and questioning hundreds of men. But even as police swept the area, new bodies kept surfacing. By the riverbanks, under bridges, and behind factories. Fear crept through the neighborhoods as people whispered about someone skilled with a knife moving through the slums at night. Investigators studied the remains carefully. Many of the cuts suggested the killer had knowledge of anatomy, maybe even medical training. Most of the victims were decapitated, and the heads were rarely found. When police laid the remains side by side, they saw how consistent the technique was. Whoever did this worked methodically. Some detectives believed the murderer might even have kept trophies, though nothing conclusive was discovered. Newspapers seized the story. Every new discovery hit the front page with lurid headlines. The idea of a phantom butcher stalking the poor ignited public panic. Rumors spread that the police knew more than they were admitting. Dozens of suspects were dragged in. One possible suspect confessed during a long interrogation, but his story fell apart, and he later retracted it, saying it had been forced out of him. Ness grew frustrated as every lead collapsed into nothing. For the once respected crime fighter, the failures were devastating. His reputation began to fade. The city that had cheered him now viewed him as powerless against an invisible enemy. By the time the killing stopped in 1938, at least 12 victims had been found. No one was charged. Smoke still drifted over the burned shanty towns, and police flashlights cut through the fog that lingered along the rails. The Mad Butcher was never caught, his shadow etched into Cleveland's streets. Decades later, another mysterious death would again divide Ohio between guilt and innocence. On a quiet Sunday night in 1954, in Bay Village, Ohio, Dr. Sam Shepard said he fell asleep on a couch downstairs while his wife Marilyn rested upstairs. Sometime after midnight, he claimed to have heard her call his name, When he ran up to their bedroom, he saw a bushy-haired intruder standing over her. According to his account, he fought with the man until he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, his wife was dead. The murder scene inside their lakefront home told a brutal story. Marilyn beaten so violently that investigators described the room as unrecognizable. Police arrived quickly, but their focus narrowed on Sam almost immediately. Cuyahoga County Coroner Sam Gerber reportedly looked around the room and said, "It's obvious that the doctor did it." Investigators found blood on Sam's trousers and believed his version of events didn't match the physical evidence. He said an intruder knocked him out twice, first upstairs and again on the beach behind the house where he claimed to have chased someone. But officers saw no tracks in the sand, no signs of a second struggle. Within days, the respected osteopath became the main suspect, and Cleveland's newspapers began printing headlines that left little room for doubt about his guilt. The Cleveland press led the coverage, running editorials demanding his arrest. Photographers camped outside his house. Reporters followed him to court, and even published the names and photos of potential jurors. The trial in November 1954 looked more like a spectacle than a judicial proceeding. The courtroom overflowed with journalists typing as witnesses testified. Shepard described the attack again, insisting that an unknown man had escaped. The jury didn't believe him. After weeks of testimony colored by intrusive headlines, Sam Shepard was convicted of second-degree murder. His imprisonment lasted more than a decade, while his defense team fought appeals arguing that the entire process had been corrupted by publicity. In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. The justices called the original trial a carnival and overturned the conviction, saying Shepard had been denied a fair trial. At his retrial later that year, attorney F. Lee Bailey presented new evidence that suggested a left-handed killer had left blood at the scene that didn't match either Sam or Marilyn. Shepard didn't testify this time, and the strategy worked. The jury found him not guilty after 12 years in prison. Freedom didn't bring peace. Shepard's medical career collapsed, and personal struggles followed him until his death in 1970. Still, the question of what happened in that house never faded. Some believe his innocence, others remain convinced of guilt. The story's ambiguity inspired the television series The Fugitive, turning tragedy into one of America's most studied murder mysteries. What began as a single, violent night became a parable about truth distorted by spectacle, and a reminder that in Ohio, sometimes even justice can disappear. Some disappearances, though, wouldn't bring headlines at all, only the silence that followed. In 1951, 10-year-old Beverly Potts left Halloran Park after a neighborhood talent show, planning to walk the short distance home before dark. The show, called the Show Wagon, had drawn hundreds of families into the park that evening. Parents sat on blankets listening to children sing and dance while the last light faded. Beverly had promised her mother she would be home before it got too late. She never made it across the street. Halloran Park sat in a quiet West Side neighborhood surrounded by small houses and tree-lined streets. During the afternoon, the air had felt festive. Local kids rode bicycles between the crowds while the stage lights flickered across the lawn. Beverly and her best friend, Patsy Swing, had arrived with their bikes, but the crowd was thick, so they decided to leave them at home and walk back. As the show ended, the crowd started thinning out, families heading toward the sidewalks and parked cars. Patsy decided to leave for home first. The last time she saw Beverly, a small, plump woman had a hand on Beverly's shoulder near the edge of the park. When Beverly failed to come home, her parents at first thought she might have stayed behind with friends. But as the hours passed, lights came on in house after house across West 117th Street, and the worry deepened. Calls to neighbors brought no news. By midnight, police officers were combing the park with flashlights, joined by hundreds of volunteers. Their beams swept across empty swings, creeks, and fields as more people joined the search through the night. Within a day, the city launched what newspapers called the biggest search in Cleveland's history. Thousands of residents looked through vacant lots, storm drains, and alleyways. The smell of damp grass and turned soil hung over the neighborhood as dogs barked into the dark. Tips flooded in, more than 1,500 in the first weeks. One boy claimed to have seen her walking across the field around 9:30 p.m. recognizing her from her distinctive duck-like walk. Police retraced every route between the park and her home, but there was no trace of her bike, her shoes, or her dress. Reporters described Halloran Park as shadowed by trees that blocked the street lights. It was the kind of place that looked safe from one angle, but turned unfamiliar once the daylight faded. Parents began escorting their children everywhere. City officials created park curfews, and stranger danger warnings became part of daily conversation long before the term existed. Beverly's mother kept a light burning by the window each night, hoping for footsteps on the walkway. That lamp stayed lit long after hope dimmed. Years passed with no ransom, no body, and no closure. Even today, the case file stays open, containing sketches and photographs that have faded from age. Beverly's disappearance became Cleveland's first enduring ghost story of modern times, a mystery that grew quieter each year but never truly ended. But even as this tragedy settled into legend, new horrors would one day take its place among the same city's streets. In 1989, a soft-spoken 10-year-old girl named Amy Mihaljevic answered her family's home phone in Bay Village, Ohio. The caller told her he knew her mother and wanted help buying a gift to celebrate her recent promotion. It sounded believable. Bay Village was the kind of small lakeside suburb where everyone seemed to know each other, and Amy was polite and trusting. The stranger arranged to meet her at Bay Square Shopping Center after school. It was a familiar place, a short bike ride away, filled with bakeries, small stores, and people her parents knew. That call would be the start of a case that would hold Cleveland's suburbs in fear for decades. On the afternoon of October 27th, Amy left school as usual. She wore a green sweatsuit and carried a small purse with a few dollars inside. Several classmates saw her walking toward the shopping center while the autumn light started fading. Witnesses later reported seeing her talking to a man near the Baskin-Robbins, a clean-cut adult who didn't seem out of place. No one realized they were watching the last moments anyone would see her alive. When Amy didn't come home for dinner, her family called police, who arrived before midnight. They searched through the nearby park and fields but found nothing. By morning, Bay Village residents were hanging flyers on telephone poles and stopping cars at intersections to ask about the missing girl. The way the abductor lured her was sophisticated. He had studied her mother's workplace and pretended to know details only a close friend would have. It wasn't a random attack. It was a plan designed to exploit familiarity and small-town trust. The case quickly grew into one of the biggest investigations in Ohio's history. The FBI and local police followed thousands of leads, interviewed teachers, co-workers, and anyone connected to Amy's family. People who had received similar phone calls in nearby towns came forward, describing someone who used the same story about buying gifts for parents. Months later, a jogger in rural Ashland County discovered Amy's body near a cornfield about 50 miles from Bay Village. Her remains were found along with small personal objects, a horse-themed bracelet, her boots, and a curtain and blanket that held crucial microscopic clues. Testing later found animal hairs matching her dog on the blanket. Fibers and DNA material were preserved long before forensic work could fully identify them. Those traces became the foundation of an open case that still evolves as technology advances. Amy's father attended annual candlelight vigils for years, standing among neighbors who refused to let her memory fade. News coverage stretched nationwide, and the case was featured on early episodes of America's Most Wanted, turning her story into a warning for every family watching. Despite all the interviews, polygraphs, and rechecks of evidence, no one has ever been charged. Her open file sits as a painful reminder that in Ohio, danger often hides in moments that seem safe, and within that comfort, violence would soon target an entire family under a prophetic spell. In 1989, a self-proclaimed prophet named Jeffrey Lundgren led his followers into a dimly lit room beneath an old farmhouse in Kirtland, Ohio. He called it a place for purification. To those who trusted him, it was supposed to be a spiritual test. But what happened that night was not redemption, it was execution. Lundgren's voice carried the weight of threat disguised as divine authority. He said he was God's final prophet, and that only through obedience could his followers escape destruction. The people who listened to him had already given him their savings, their homes, and eventually their will to resist. Lundgren built his ideology around a twisted method he called chiastic interpretation. He claimed it revealed hidden patterns in Scripture that only he could see. Using this, he convinced his followers that every command he gave came directly from God. His isolated farmhouse became both church and fortress. No outside logic penetrated there. Families worked, prayed, and studied under constant supervision, believing they were preparing for the world's end. The small town of Kirtland, once known for the historic temple built by early Latter-day Saints members, became the stage for another story of blind devotion. Among those who followed Lundgren was Dennis Avery, his wife Cheryl, and their 3 daughters Trina, Becky, and Karen. The Averys were loyal, but not fanatical. They questioned small things. Lundgren noticed. He began treating them as spiritually weak, warning others they might threaten the group's salvation. When he announced that the time had come for a blood sacrifice to cleanse the faithful, his inner circle knew exactly who would be chosen. The plan was disguised as a family camping trip. One by one, he led the Averys into the barn. Dennis Avery was shot twice in the back. Cheryl, gagged and terrified, followed next. Their daughters came after, 13-year-old Becky, the oldest, then 6-year-old Karen, the youngest. Each was killed with the same cold precision and buried beneath the barn floor. The ground was later covered with hay, the air carrying no sign of what lay below. For days, Lundgren's followers lived above those shallow graves, eating, praying, and listening to his sermons. When the truth came out, it shattered what little stability Kirtland had left. Investigators unearthed the bodies in a single line, still wearing the clothes they'd left home in. Lundgren was arrested after fleeing across the country, and during his trial, he showed no remorse. He insisted he was carrying out divine will. He was later sentenced to death and executed in 2006. Survivors of the cult still describe lasting trauma, memories of control so complete that they questioned their own sense of morality for years. The Kirtland murders became a symbol of what happens when faith is poisoned by isolation. In a quiet farming town, devotion turned deadly, and one man's scripture became the language of death. Decades earlier, isolation had taken a different form, through organized crime tearing Cleveland's streets apart. By the mid-1970s, Cleveland's neighborhoods began shaking from explosions that seemed to come without pattern or warning. Car after car erupted in fireballs that lit up parking lots and alleyways. Each blast carried the same signature: tight timing, military-grade wiring, and precision that suggested an expert's hand. Behind most of them was Danny Green, a man who'd built his empire around labor unions, protection rackets, and explosives. Residents started calling their city Bomb City, USA, a name born from fear that no one wanted but everyone used. Green's story began on the docks of Lake Erie. He was a longshoreman who hustled his way into union leadership by standing up to corrupt officials, earning both attention and enemies. Charismatic and sharply dressed, he shaped himself into something larger than life. To locals, Green talked about pride in Irish heritage and fairness for working men. But that charm hid a violent ambition. Once pushed out of the union, he took his expertise into the streets, forming his own gang and stepping into Cleveland's growing mob scene. He liked control, and bombs became his signature language. He presented himself as a champion for his neighborhood, a modern-day Robin Hood who gave handouts to poor families and paid for kids' school supplies. Some residents admired him, seeing a man unafraid of city power brokers. But for anyone who crossed him, the message came loud and clear, often delivered through twisted wreckage. He had a knack for planting bombs underneath rival cars, setting timers that detonated when the ignition turned. Green's notoriety grew as local and national papers covered the endless explosions, each one more brazen than the last. One early rival, Michael Fratto, tried to challenge him after a falling out over union money. In a confrontation near White City Park Beach, Fratto fired at Green from his car. Green shot back, killing him with a single bullet to the head. He claimed self-defense and walked free. After that, few dared oppose him openly. Another rival, Shondor Burns, once a powerful gangster himself, died in 1975 when a car bomb tore apart his Lincoln. Everyone suspected Green, though prosecutors could never tie him to the attack. With every unsolved explosion, his myth deepened. Investigators documented dozens of bombings linked to Green's war with both the Irish and Italian factions controlling Cleveland's underworld. By 1977, it was open combat, cars blown up in driveways, garages leveled overnight. Green became a figure both feared and strangely respected for surviving so long, but his luck ended one September afternoon in Lyndhurst. As he stepped from a dentist's office toward his green Continental, an explosion lifted the car off the ground. Steel fragments flew across the nearby storefronts as bystanders froze in shock. Green's death marked the end of the bomb wars, but it also unmasked decades of corruption hidden beneath city politics and organized crime. His story inspired newspapers, books, and later films, all circling the same truth. Cleveland's balance between order and chaos was thin. When he was gone, the silence felt uneasy, like the pause after the echo of a final blast. As Cleveland struggled to rebuild, belief itself turned corrupt again, this time within identities stolen, not shared. On a summer night in 1990, 16-year-old Lisa Pruett slipped out of her house in Shaker Heights, Ohio, planning to meet her boyfriend just a few streets away. The neighborhood was quiet and lined with tall trees, the kind of place parents still felt safe letting their kids walk after dark. Lisa left around midnight, carrying a note and a sketch she had drawn for him earlier that evening. She never arrived. Hours later, her body was found near a ravine path behind a large house, stabbed repeatedly. Her clothes were torn, her watch smashed, and her walk home turned into one of Ohio's most puzzling unsolved murders. The police response was immediate. Shaker Heights had not seen violence like this in decades, especially involving a local honor student. Investigators roped off the yard where she was found, a dense area near the edge of an overgrown ravine that separated two residential blocks. Friends and neighbors gathered in disbelief behind the yellow tape. Rumors started spreading before sunrise. Teenagers whispered about a stalker, an ex-friend, or a stranger hiding near the path. Detectives ruled out robbery, nothing had been taken, and focused on people from Lisa's circle. Within days, attention turned to another local teen named Kevin Young. He was known as eccentric, watched by classmates who never quite understood him, but many said he was harmless. Police built a case on statements from other students. They said Kevin had made odd comments about Lisa, though none of it fit together cleanly. The physical evidence was thin. When investigators tested blood and fibers, results came back inconclusive. Kevin was arrested and charged with her murder, a shock that divided the community. Some saw him as a scapegoat, others believed justice had come quickly. The trial dragged on for months, generating front-page stories that described every fragment of high school drama as potential motive. In the end, the jury found him not guilty. There wasn't enough to prove he had even been near the scene that night. After the acquittal, investigators kept revisiting the evidence, hoping advances in DNA might solve what the original case couldn't. Still, no match ever surfaced. The murder became more like a myth repeated in classrooms and coffee shops, always with a new theory attached. Different people claimed to know who really did it, none with proof. Lisa's family stayed in Shaker Heights for years, answering reporters politely but never finding closure. They lived each day on the same streets where she'd walked her final steps. Time has softened the edges of the story but never erased it. The wooded shortcut still winds behind quiet houses, unchanged in decades. Residents say the place feels heavy after dark. Whether the killer was someone Lisa trusted or a stranger passing through, no one has ever confessed. Her murder remains an obsession for a community that once believed safety was guaranteed by good schools and manicured lawns. In 2009, Cleveland police stepped into a boarded house on Imperial Avenue after receiving a complaint about a foul odor. What they discovered inside stopped even seasoned detectives cold. 11 women's bodies were hidden throughout the home, some buried in shallow dirt in the basement, others stuffed into crawl spaces or wrapped in sheets on the third floor. The smell that neighbors had complained about for months was not from garbage or plumbing. It came from years of murder. The man responsible was Anthony Sowell, a quiet, reclusive figure known for keeping to himself. Sowell had been living at 12,205 Imperial Avenue since his release from prison after serving 15 years for attempted rape. He rarely spoke to neighbors and was seen walking through the area alone, often with a blank expression that gave little away. The house itself looked like many in the decaying neighborhood. Boards on the windows, uneven siding, front steps beginning to split apart. People nearby mentioned an odor for almost a year, but complaints were lost among reports of abandoned buildings and decaying trash piles. No one expected what was sealed behind those walls. Inside, investigators found the gruesome remains of women who had gone missing between 2007 and 2009. Each victim told the same story in fragments left behind. They had been strangled, some gagged, some with restraints still clinging to bones. The victims' ages ranged from 25 to 53, many of them mothers. Most lived on the margins of Cleveland's east side, struggling with addiction or poverty, which made their disappearances almost invisible to authorities. Their families filed missing person reports again and again, yet the files gathered dust. Many of those reports matched the same street, the very address where Sowell lived. Several women survived encounters with him, describing desperate escapes from his home after being beaten and choked. Their testimonies showed how the system broke down. Officers dismissed their accounts as personal disputes, ignoring clear warnings. When the truth came out, the public anger was immediate. Families of victims stood outside the cordoned yard demanding to know how this could have gone unnoticed for so long. After weeks of excavation, the home was demolished. In its place today stands the Garden of 11 Angels, a quiet memorial of flowers and stones etched with each victim's name. Beneath its calm surface lies the weight of unanswered questions about how neglect and poverty allowed such horror to thrive. Sowell's trial in 2011 revealed not just one man's brutality but a city's apathy toward neighborhoods left to rot. He was convicted of all counts and sentenced to death, later dying in prison from illness in 2021. Yet the real story was bigger than him. It was about disappeared women in forgotten streets, the repeated warnings no one heard, and how entire communities had learned that even screams could go unnoticed. But even after justice, another predator would rise just blocks away. When an elderly engineer in Eastlake, Ohio, took his own life in July 2002, police thought they were handling a routine suicide. The man had lived quietly in a small apartment for years, paying bills on time and working without drawing attention. His driver's license, insurance cards, and social security records all identified him as Joseph Newton Chandler III. It wasn't until investigators tried to reach his next of kin that they realized his entire identity was built on a lie. The real Joseph Chandler had died in a car crash in Texas nearly 50 years earlier. Whoever this man was, he had stolen the identity of a child. Detectives searched his apartment expecting clues about family or work, but found only fragments. There were detailed receipts, grocery lists, and an unusual number of road maps neatly folded in drawers. But there were no photographs, no personal letters, and no trace of family anywhere. His work history placed him at an engineering firm where co-workers described him as polite but reclusive. He avoided social events and disappeared quickly after each shift. When police checked his social security number, they found it had been created long after the real Joseph Chandler's death, indicating a deliberate identity theft that started decades earlier. Federal investigators took over, working under the assumption that they were dealing with a long-term fugitive. They ruled out espionage, fraud, and witness protection cases, but still had no real name to attach to the man who had died. Years passed before forensic genealogists used small DNA samples from his remains to begin tracing possible relatives. The match pointed to someone named Robert Ivan Nichols, a Navy veteran from New Albany, Indiana, who had vanished in 1965 without explanation. Nichols had burned his military documents, left his family, and disappeared. His children spent decades never knowing whether he was alive. The discovery stunned both families. One learning their father never died but had chosen to erase himself, the other reliving the loss of a boy whose name had been stolen. Records confirmed that soon after Nichols abandoned his old life, he visited the Social Security office in Rapid City, South Dakota, applied for a replacement card using Joseph Newton Chandler's name, and began his new identity. He then lived under that name for nearly 40 years, working quietly across the Midwest until settling in Eastlake. Investigators still debate what drove him to start over. Some believe remorse or mental illness. Others point to a secret crime never uncovered. No evidence ties him to violence or financial wrongdoing. His motive vanished with him. What makes the case haunting isn't the paperwork or mystery of genetics. It's the silence of a man who chose to disappear inside a borrowed name, leaving behind an empty apartment and a life that never truly existed. In the summer of 2013, East Cleveland officers arrived at a small apartment building on Shaw Avenue after neighbors reported a strong odor coming from a nearby garage. What they found led to one of the most disturbing discoveries the city had seen since the days of the Imperial Avenue murders. Inside and around the property of 35-year-old Michael Madison, police uncovered the bodies of 3 young women wrapped in plastic bags. The air was thick and humid, carrying what residents would later describe as a smell that no one could forget. For investigators, it was an all-too-familiar beginning to another serial murder case hidden inside an ordinary neighborhood. Madison had grown up in the same city where he would later become known for killing. To those who lived nearby, he blended in. He worked odd jobs, smiled at neighbors, and helped older residents carry groceries. But underneath that exterior ran a pattern of violence that had already taken shape. The women he targeted were vulnerable, often struggling with housing or addiction, people who could disappear without immediate notice. The victims' names, Sherelda Terry, Angela Deskins, and Shatisha Sheely, would later be read aloud during his trial, each carrying its own story of trust misplaced. Police traced the odor to a garage on the property where a tarp was pulled tight over something large. When officers lifted it, they saw what was left of one of the victims. 2 more bodies were located nearby, one inside a vacant lot and another in the basement of a nearby building. The crime scenes were close together, separated by a few hundred feet, creating a small radius of horror in an area already struggling with vacancy and neglect. Officers wore masks as they worked, opening every abandoned structure in the vicinity. Residents gathered behind the police tape, some recognizing faces from missing person posters. Investigators described Madison as calm during his arrest, neither shocked nor angry. In interviews, he spoke vaguely about power and control, referencing other killers as if comparing himself. Detectives concluded that he had committed at least 3 murders between 2012 and 2013, using strangulation as his primary method. Evidence found in his apartment included plastic sheeting, tape, and personal items believed to belong to his victims. Each discovery reinforced a grim picture of a man operating unnoticed in a community already worn down by distrust and fear. His trial drew national attention, reopening wounds within the city that had not yet healed. Family members packed the courtroom, and when verdicts were read, the silence felt heavier than applause could ever carry. Madison was sentenced to death in 2016, showing little emotion as families of the victims spoke through tears. The demolitions that followed removed the buildings where the victims had been found, leaving behind only open lots. Yet the memory of that summer lingers, carried through the neighborhood's vacant streets as a reminder that even after one darkness ends, another can quietly take its place. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in March 2013, 47-year-old Eliza Sherman parked her car near Erie View Plaza in downtown Cleveland. She was there for a meeting with her divorce attorney, Gregory Moore. Security cameras caught her walking along the sidewalk toward his office building, carrying her purse and phone. It was broad daylight. Foot traffic was light but steady, a typical weekend afternoon in a part of the city known more for offices and clinics than for crime. A few minutes later, she was lying on the pavement outside the doors of the building, bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Passers-by rushed to call 911, but within hours, Eliza was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. Investigators pieced together a timeline. Eliza had spoken to Moore that morning to confirm their appointment. Her family later said she seemed calm, expecting to discuss her ongoing divorce. When detectives reviewed surveillance footage, they saw her entering the plaza but never clearly spotted the attacker. Blind spots between cameras left parts of the assault invisible. What made the case immediately strange was that nothing was taken. Her purse, keys, and phone were found beside her. It didn't fit robbery. It felt targeted. Detectives began with her inner circle. Moore's name came up quickly, not only because he was the last to expect her, but because their communication had become inconsistent. When police first questioned him, his timeline of movements that day didn't line up cleanly. Cell tower records placed his phone near the scene during the attack. He denied involvement, claiming coincidence. Investigators pressed harder, uncovering inconsistencies about clothing, phone calls, and messages deleted after he was asked for cooperation. Months later, a Cuyahoga County grand jury indicted Gregory Moore for aggravated murder, conspiracy, murder, and kidnapping, alleging that he planned the attack, lied to officers, and attempted to hide evidence. He had already served 6 months on unrelated charges for misleading police during the early investigation. Still, he maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty. The case stalled in motions and appeals, evidence hearings dragging on for years while Eliza's family waited for resolution that never came. For downtown workers who passed that sidewalk daily, her death changed how the city felt. The crime hadn't happened in an isolated neighborhood, but in an area surrounded by professional offices and parking garages. A mother of 4 had been stabbed to death only steps from a crowded street. Residents began locking their car doors even in daytime traffic. Businesses installed new security cameras, and evening foot traffic declined sharply in the months that followed. Her family made repeated public pleas for closure, led often by her daughter, who stood beside officers during press conferences, describing the ache of unanswered questions. The case remains open, one of Cleveland's few unsolved high-profile daylight murders. Eliza's final steps showed how vulnerability can exist in the most ordinary places, how a short walk to a meeting can end in unexplainable violence. The daylight stabbing blurred the line between safety and exposure, leaving behind a silence that never fully left the city's center. On the afternoon of October 6, 1977, the parking lot outside a dentist's office on Mayfield Road in Lyndhurst looked like any other weekday scene. People were coming and going for appointments, the sound of traffic from the nearby intersection cutting through the fall air. At around 3 o'clock, a man named Danny Green stepped outside, carrying the confidence of someone who had survived more assassination attempts than most Cleveland mobsters could count. He walked to his car, a green Chevrolet Continental, and reached for the handle. A blast ripped through the lot, shattering windows, scattering debris across storefronts, and killing him instantly. What looked like another routine day in the suburbs became the moment that cracked open years of organized warfare inside Cleveland's underworld. Green had risen from the city's working-class docks to become one of the most feared figures in Cleveland's criminal history. Known for his bright green clothing, his Irish pride, and his willingness to use violence as strategy, he thrived during the years when the city's organized crime scene was exploding with rivalries. He positioned himself as an independent operator between the existing Irish and Italian mobs, demanding tribute from both and paying loyalty to neither. Those close to him described an unusual mixture of charm and ruthlessness, a man who could give to local charities in the morning and plant a bomb that night. By 1977, explosive devices had become his trademark. At least 30 car bombings had rocked the Cleveland area in the previous 2 years, many traced back to Green's feud with the Italian crime family led by Angelo Leonardo and John Nardi. Green's network operated across the city's east side, meeting in coffee shops and union halls, always surrounded by whispers of payoffs and betrayal. Federal agents followed him for months, recording his movements but never catching enough evidence to tie him directly to the bombings he ordered. He bragged that everyone wanted him dead and that he was ready when they came for him. That prediction came true in Lyndhurst. As Green stepped toward his car, a man across the lot pressed a remote detonator from inside another vehicle. The bomb, packed with dynamite and hidden beneath the driver's seat, left a crater in the pavement. Shards of metal struck nearby cars and a restaurant window. Witnesses ducked behind benches or ran for cover, not realizing until later who the victim was. Within hours, news stations were reporting the death of the man police had long called the most dangerous figure in Cleveland. Green's assassination unraveled the city's mob network. Wiretaps and surveillance tied his killers back to the same organized crime circles he had fought against for years, leading to dozens of indictments in cooperation with federal investigators. His death brought an end to the period journalists labeled the Cleveland Bomb Wars and exposed the city's criminal alliances to national attention. The explosion in that suburban parking lot silenced Green, but it forced open the secrets he'd built his empire on, leaving behind a legacy of ambition, control, and detonation. On a warm July morning in 2007, 14-year-old Ashley Summers left a relative's house on Cleveland's west side and started walking toward home. It was only a short trip, the kind most kids her age made without thinking about it. She told her family she would be back later that day. But as hours passed and no one heard from her, what began as a routine summer visit turned into one of the most persistent missing person mysteries in the city's recent history. Her neighborhood sat near the Lakewood-Cleveland border, a patchwork of small houses, corner stores, and narrow alleys that looked nearly identical one to the next. Ashley had grown up there, surrounded by cousins and friends. That weekend she had been staying with her great-uncle and planned to return home for a cookout. When darkness came and she didn't show up, her family started calling everyone they could think of. Friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her walking. No one had. At first, police treated her as a possible runaway. Teenagers sometimes left for a few days, especially during arguments at home, and officers assumed she would reappear. Days turned into weeks, and the calls that once filled her mother's nights went unanswered. Detectives eventually shifted from the runaway theory. Ashley's close bond with her siblings and her young age made voluntary disappearance unlikely. Flyers with her face spread through the city's west side. Her photo, a small smile and shoulder-length brown hair, was added to the National Missing Child database. The Cleveland FBI office joined the case, tracing phone records, interviewing anyone still in contact with her, and checking bus stations in Ohio and neighboring states. Despite the scope, no new lead emerged. Rumors quickly surrounded the case. Some residents claimed to have spotted her downtown or near the West Side markets. Others wondered about connections to other abductions that had shaken the area in previous years. Investigators looked closely at those links but found no solid evidence. Each potential match raised hopes only briefly, before fading back into silence. A few years later, a woman was caught using Ashley's name to claim government benefits. She admitted later that she'd simply chosen the alias at random. For her family, every false report reopened the wound of not knowing. Over the years, digital billboards have shown her face beside the word missing, updated with an age-progressed image created by forensic artists. The FBI continues to re-examine evidence using new databases and DNA technology. Her relatives still organize small vigils, choosing streets where she once rode her bike as children run past wearing shirts printed with her photo. For them, Ashley isn't a cold case. She's a person whose seat is still empty at family gatherings. Today, her disappearance sits between memory and rumor, the kind of story new residents hear whispered, but few truly understand. 14 years old, gone without a trace, and never confirmed sighting since. Ashley Summers remains missing, a quiet reminder that even familiar streets can hold places where somebody simply vanishes. Just before dawn on April 17, 1966, two Portage County Sheriff's deputies were checking an abandoned car off a rural road near Ravenna, Ohio. The field was quiet, coated in thin fog. When Deputy Dale Spar stepped from his cruiser, he heard a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Then a bright circular light rose from behind a line of trees. It grew larger until it hovered above them, so bright that it lit the tops of the patrol cars and the road around them. The sound deepened into a steady hum as the craft angled east, beginning a chase that would stretch across 2 states and become one of the best documented UFO cases in Ohio history. Spore and his partner, Wilbur Barney Neff, jumped into their car and sped after it. The object moved ahead, just above the trees, gliding silently except for that peculiar vibration. Over the radio, they called in what they were seeing, an enormous metallic object moving faster than any plane they could identify. Another unit confirmed the light from miles away. As the deputies picked up speed, the craft rose higher, then slowed as if it were letting them keep up. The men described it later as roughly the size of a house, with a bright dome that seemed to glow from within. Drivers along the highway pulled over to watch the same thing climbing through the morning haze. When the chase reached the state line, Pennsylvania police began tracking the same object. It passed silently over farms and towns, staying low enough that people could see the light reflect off the fields below. At times it appeared to stop completely, then shoot forward again in a smooth, deliberate motion. The pursuit finally ended near the town of Conway, where the deputies were ordered to break off. They stopped on an empty road, watching as the light drifted upward until it vanished into the brightening sky. Project Blue Book, the Air Force investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena, quickly labeled the event a case of astronomical misidentification. Officials claimed the men had chased the planet Venus as it rose, perhaps distorted by the atmosphere. But the explanation failed to cover key facts. Radar near Youngstown had indeed picked up an unidentified return that morning, matching the chase timeline. The observed maneuvers and variable altitude didn't fit a star or planet. The deputies firmly stood by what they saw, filing reports that ended with a simple question: what did we just see? Ufologists have called it one of the most credible Great Lakes sightings on record. Trained law enforcement witnesses, simultaneous radar support, and corroboration across jurisdictions. Years later, the event reappeared in declassified Navy case files describing similar shaped objects moving over Lake Erie. For many in Northeast Ohio, the Portage County chase became more than a curiosity. It joined the industrial skyline and rusting rail lines as part of the region's identity, a brief moment when something vast and unexplained hovered above the decay, untouched by it. Back on shore, another kind of disaster still burned in memory, one where fire replaced light in the sky. In the early 1980s, neighbors in the Cleveland suburb of Seven Hills knew John Demjanjuk as a quiet, retired auto worker. He had worked for years at a Ford plant, drove a modest car, and lived with his family in a simple brick house. To anyone nearby, he seemed like countless other immigrants who had settled in the area after the war, private, polite, and reserved. That image shattered in 1977 when U.S. investigators accused him of having a darker past. They said Demjanjuk was not just a factory worker. They claimed he was Ivan the Terrible, a guard who tortured and killed prisoners at the Treblinka death camp during World War II. At first, the idea seemed unthinkable. Demjanjuk was in his late 50s, a man who mowed his lawn and attended church. But prosecutors said a Nazi identification card, marked with his photo and the name Ivan Demjanjuk, proved his role at Sobibor, Majdanek, and Treblinka camps. Survivors of Treblinka later testified that the man known as Ivan had brutalized prisoners and operated gas chambers. With mounting evidence, Mihaljevic was stripped of his U.S. citizenship and extradited to Israel in 1986 to face charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The trial in Jerusalem immediately drew international attention. Survivors of Treblinka filled the courtroom, pointing at Mihaljevic as the man they remembered. Television coverage followed every testimony. The verdict came in 1988. Guilty, sentenced to death. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse in celebration of long-delayed justice. But on appeal, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Newly uncovered evidence from Soviet archives suggested prosecutors had misidentified the camp location, and another Ukrainian named Ivan Marchenko might have been the real Ivan the Terrible. Mihaljevic returned to Ohio in 1993, his citizenship still revoked, but his guilt unresolved. Federal officials reopened the investigation years later. This time the focus shifted. Instead of Treblinka, documents linked Mihaljevic to the Sobibor and Flossenburg camps as a trained guard for the SS's Troniki division. Again, he was denaturalized and extradited, this time to Germany in 2009. The trial began in Munich with Mihaljevic, now 89 years old, frail and confined to a wheelchair. German prosecutors argued that as a guard, he was complicit in the deaths of more than 28,000 Jews. In 2011, the court found him guilty of aiding and abetting mass murder. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison but released pending appeal due to his age and health. Mihaljevic died in a German care facility in 2012, still protesting his innocence. His case remains one of the most disputed of any war crimes proceeding. Supporters saw him as a victim of mistaken identity caught in political crossfire. Critics viewed him as a symbol of delayed justice. The image of an ordinary Ohio pensioner revealed as a suspected war criminal unsettled the idea that history stays buried overseas. In Seven Hills, the small brick house on a quiet street still stands, a reminder that even the suburbs can hold secrets large enough to stretch across generations and continents. The Victorian mansion known as Franklin Castle still stands on Franklin Boulevard, its narrow turrets and carved stonework looming over the street. Locals say that at night, the windows seem to follow anyone who passes, the glass catching glints of light even when the rest of the house is dark. Built in the 1880s, it was first home to banker Hannes Tiedemann and his family. Inside its walls, life mixed with tragedy. Within a few short years, several of the Tiedemann's children died, along with Hannes's mother. The loss set the stage for a reputation the building would carry for more than a century. People said too much grief sank into the woodwork for the house ever to feel peaceful again. As decades passed, new owners came and went, each uncovering something different. Contractors making repairs in the mid-20th century found what looked like narrow tunnels snaking behind walls, small spaces cut between rooms without visible doors. Later crews reported a hidden staircase leading from the main parlor down into a cramped chamber beneath the house. No one could be sure why the openings existed, storage, servants' passages, or something else. But every discovery deepened the folklore that the house had secrets to keep. When talk spread of skeletons found behind false walls and sealed doors, visitors began arriving not to buy, but to look and listen. Owners described the same uneasy stillness that filled the house after dark. Cold drafts moved through hallways even when windows were secure. Footsteps echoed across upper floors long after everyone had left for the night. Longtime residents swore they could hear what sounded like children playing in the upstairs bedrooms when the rooms were empty. Others spoke of a faint woman's sob rising from behind a sealed door near the back stairwell. Those who stayed inside said the sound seemed to move with them, not coming from a single place, but everywhere at once. Each buyer arrived hoping to restore Franklin Castle and left with the same story of restlessness. Some blamed the structure's design, the maze of rooms, the weight of the wood beams, the way old houses breathe with the weather. Others talked about pressure, a heaviness impossible to explain. Through fires, partial collapses, and long years of vacancy, the mansion kept standing. Its peaked roof and stained glass still face forward as the skyline of modern Cleveland changes around it. The dark stone makes it look almost out of time, a Gothic monument in a city of apartment blocks and coffee shops. Even without proof of spirits, the building seems to hold emotion within its frame. What began as family tragedy became rumor, then legend, until the story of Franklin Castle replaced the history itself. Paranormal crews still request access, and preservation workers treat every floorboard as fragile memory. Whether truly haunted or not, the mansion endures as proof that stories can preserve pain long after the walls stop breathing. Just a few miles away, another building of death and legend waits, the House of Wills. Decayed yet grand, the House of Wills still dominates East 55th Street. The building's tall stone facade rises over cracked sidewalks, its fading letters spelling a name that once carried weight across Cleveland's black community. For decades, this was one of the city's most respected funeral homes, a meeting place where grief and dignity were handled with care. The structure dates back to the late 1800s, but its modern identity formed in the 1940s when it became a black-owned institution central to the civil rights era. Funerals here were as much about remembrance as they were about community strength. Thousands of Cleveland residents passed through its doors to say final goodbyes, music echoing through marble halls and light filtering through stained glass set above the sanctuary. In those years, the House of Wills stood as a symbol of perseverance, a safe space in a divided city. Time changed that promise. As Cleveland's population declined and neighborhoods emptied, the business faded. By the early 2000s, the funeral home was abandoned. Paint peeled from ceilings, and dust-covered pews where hymns had once reached the rafters. Urban explorers began stepping through broken side doors, drawn by rumor and history. They recorded shifting lights that flickered in rooms without electricity, cold air that moved like breath across the back of their necks, and what some swore were voices echoing from the chapel even when the building stood empty. The stories spread online, turning the House of Wills into one of Ohio's most recognized urban legends. Inside, the contrast between what was and what remains is stark. The wide marble staircase still curves gracefully toward the second floor, though the railing now sways under weight. Cracked organ pipes sit silent near the chapel, their surfaces dim under years of grime. In the main hall, sunlight cuts through broken panes, catching dust motes that drift slowly across faded floor tiles. Explorers often describe an uneasy calm, a feeling of being watched in silence rather than outright fear. Filmmakers who have entered for documentaries call the building physically overwhelming, its stillness carrying both sadness and respect, as though the walls themselves remember every name once spoken in grief. The transformation from a place of service to one of decay mirrors the city around it. The House of Wills once represented community pride and social dignity. Now, it reflects loss in a different way. What happens when memory outlives maintenance? The grandeur has not vanished entirely. It lingers in fragments. A sheet of stained glass still shining blue at midday, carved wood panels surviving beneath layers of paint, and the faint smell of old flowers trapped in the air. To stand in those halls is to feel Cleveland's own endurance. The House of Wills bridges life, death, and memory, holding the echo of a past too powerful to leave quietly. And just beyond the shores, another legend continues swimming somewhere between truth and imagination. At the start of a typical March morning in 1908, the Lakeview School in Collinwood, Ohio, came alive with the sounds of children filling its wooden halls. The two-story building looked sturdy from the outside, built of brick and decorated with tall windows that let in the daylight. Inside, though, the structure relied on pine beams and narrow stairways that trapped heat and smoke. Around 9:30 a.m., a teacher walking near the basement stairwell saw wisps of smoke curling upward. Within minutes, the first floor was engulfed, and the sound of the bell that usually marked class time turned into chaos. As the fire spread, teachers tried to lead students toward the exits, but the building's design turned deadly. Doors opened inward instead of outward, locking tight as crowds pushed from behind. The main staircase became a choke point. Flames turned the banisters into collapsing torches, and smoke filled every corridor. Some teachers managed to break windows, lifting students onto ledges and trying to catch them below. A few jumped from the second floor, landing on frozen ground broken by stone. The rest remained trapped inside, packed shoulder to shoulder as the temperature soared. Witnesses outside described seeing children's faces at the windows, some waving, others pressed against glass that turned black almost instantly. Parents who lived nearby ran toward the rising smoke, many still in their work clothes, shouting their children's names over the roar. One recalled years later how the screaming stopped all at once. By the time the roof caved in, 172 people were dead, mainly students, along with several teachers and rescuers. The town square became a temporary morgue as families tried to identify what remained of loved ones among ash and debris. The investigation began almost immediately. Some said the blaze had started from faulty wiring, others blamed a furnace malfunction. The official report listed the cause as unknown origin. Public anger demanded answers, forcing new safety reforms across the country. Fire codes changed, exit doors in schools were redesigned to swing outward, and fire drills became common practice nationwide. But in Collinwood, reform wasn't enough to replace what was lost. The school's blackened shell stood for years, too painful to tear down. Residents talked about standing outside the fence after dark and hearing echoes from the yard, soft, high sounds that could have been wind or children playing. Workers clearing rubble found marbles, shoes, and metal hairpins among the charred wood, tiny reminders of what once filled those classrooms. The site later became a memorial park, though people said the ground seemed different, like it breathed when the temperature dropped. The Collinwood School fire was more than tragedy. It was a wound that never healed, its memory carried through generations and kept alive by the silence that follows every unanswered what if. Since 1817, sailors on Lake Erie have told stories about something large moving beneath the surface, a long, dark form that rose and fell with the waves before disappearing again. They called it Bessie, a name that over time became as much a part of local vocabulary as any street or harbor. The earliest documented sighting came from a group of shipmen near the mouth of the Huron River. They described a giant serpent-like creature that surfaced alongside their boat, its skin pale gray, its motion smooth and deliberate before it slipped back into the lake. Since then, reports have appeared every few years, each one adding a new detail to the legend. Through the 19th century, newspaper columns covered Bessie sightings with the same tone used for shipwrecks or storms. In 1892, fishermen off Cedar Point claimed to have watched a 30-foot-long shape rolling just beyond the breakers. A few months later, two brothers commercial fishing near Sandusky said a snake with fins lifted from the water and vanished under their boat. Later accounts from Coast Guard members and recreational boaters described nearly identical movements, a single curved body breaking the calm water before diving again. The similarities turned coincidence into pattern. Some lake historians have argued that the sightings could have simple explanations. Lake Erie is shallow and dynamic, filled with underwater ridges and fast-changing currents. A long log caught in surface chop or a large sturgeon breaching at dusk could distort distance and scale, but others point to the consistency across centuries, suggesting something more. Modern sonar readings have occasionally picked up large objects moving at odd speeds near the same coordinates where sightings occurred decades apart. None were experienced enough to dismiss what they saw entirely. Unlike most lake monsters that linger in local myth, Bessie has taken on a strangely friendly reputation. In Cleveland and Huron, she appears on brewery labels, festival banners, and children's t-shirts. A mascot costume sometimes swims laps during summer events by the pier. The idea of a creature beneath the waves is no longer a warning but a kind of shared secret, a nod to the lake's mysteries that everyone pretends to half believe. That shift from fright to affection shows how stories evolve when they become part of place identity. Still, every so often, a new sighting draws quiet attention. A chewed-up net near Marblehead, a strange ripple pattern photographed at sunrise near the Cleveland breakwall. They renew the old question of what, if anything, lives there. Fishermen swear that on still evenings when the water goes glass smooth and silent, something moves just far enough offshore to be real but unreachable. Whether Bessie is myth, misidentification, or something alive that has mastered secrecy, she survives as Lake Erie's most enduring resident. Generations have come and gone, industries have risen and collapsed along the shoreline, but the ripples in the water keep reminding Cleveland that not every ghost belongs to the land. On the night of March 4, 1969, 4 members of the U.S. Coast Guard were stationed at their observation post near Edgewater Park in Cleveland. Their shift had been uneventful until just after 6 p.m., when one of them noticed unusual lights hovering above Lake Erie. The sky over the lake was clear, the water mostly calm, and visibility stretched for miles. The crew at first thought they were watching aircraft coming in from Canada, but the lights never followed flight paths. Within minutes, all 4 men stood outside their station staring upward as 4 glowing, football-shaped objects appeared in the distance. They were arranged in a straight line before abruptly moving into a diamond formation that lit the clouds above the shoreline. The Coast Guardsmen described the lights as bright white at the center with a soft orange halo. They made no noise, no exhaust trail, and seemed to drift with deliberate motion. The objects hovered at roughly 2,000 feet, then darted in separate directions faster than any conventional plane could move before returning to the same position. The guards recorded the incident in their official logbook, noting both the time and direction of movement. They also radioed the FAA tower at Burke Lakefront Airport, which confirmed that radar operators had unidentified returns over the lake at that exact moment. For the next 45 minutes, the crew watched as the glowing shapes shifted between geometric patterns, circle, line, then back again, before one object shot upward and vanished. The remaining 3 followed seconds later, disappearing toward the horizon over the open water. The Coast Guard officers stood in silence, waiting for some explanation, but none came. Later that night, 2 commercial pilots contacted controllers to report unusual illumination above the lake's surface, describing lights that appeared and disappeared without navigation beacons. The official investigation began the next day. Military representatives interviewed the witnesses separately, checking for consistency. Each man gave nearly identical descriptions, down to the color and motion of the objects. Air Force personnel later labeled the incident unidentified aerial phenomena with multiple visual components, but suggested possible reflections from ships or distant industrial lights. That theory never matched the radar return data or the eyewitness timeline. Over time, files related to the sighting were quietly archived, leaving researchers to debate whether the event fit into a broader pattern of Great Lakes phenomena. For the men who stood on duty that night, the experience left lasting doubt about what they had seen. Some retired, still discussing the lights, calling them machines that didn't belong. Decades later, declassified reports referenced the 1969 Lake Erie encounter as one of the best documented aerial incidents involving uniformed personnel. To this day, no conclusive explanation exists. The sighting remains one of Cleveland's most compelling lakefront mysteries, an open question floating just beyond the shoreline, where routine watch duty turned into something that defied every expectation. Cleveland's story stretches across smokestacks, lake water, and the ruins left behind when industry fell quiet. The same streets that once fed steel and freight later carried whispers of disappearances and crimes that no one could solve. Abandoned houses became hiding places, and trust turned fragile. Every decade left another layer of mystery, blending progress with pain. What began as a city of work and ambition hardened into something colder and harder to ignore. It's why so many of Ohio's darkest stories begin here. In Ohio, darkness doesn't come from the woods, it leaks up from the city itself. From the torso murders to the shadows in suburban neighborhoods, Ohio shows us that horror doesn't always hide in the wilderness. It can be waiting right outside your door. That's why these stories stay with us, because they remind us that safety is never guaranteed. If this journey pulled you in, let me know in the comments which mystery still lingers with you. And if you want more nights like this, hit like, subscribe to The Last Two Awake, and keep walking with me into the stories most people would rather forget.